Okay, great. Thanks very much for coming and welcome to this edition of the Stockholm Seminars, Frontiers in Sustainability Science. My name is Tim Daw. I'm a researcher here at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And just to introduce this seminar series, these Stockholm Seminars are open seminars covering a broad range of questions related to sustainability science with a focus on the dynamics and stewardship of social ecological systems. And they're hosted, you're here at Stockholm Resilience Centre today, but they're also co-hosted with the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Albaeco, Future Earth, and Stockholm Resilience Centre. And these have been running since 2000, and so this is the latest edition in a series of over 100 presentations by some of the world's leading scientists and thinkers and activists in the sustainability space. So I'm sure we're going to have a good contribution to that series, and you can see many of the previous seminars online. I'm very, very excited to welcome Rich Wilson here to Stockholm today. As you know, some of you may know that there has been some experimentation with citizen assemblies, particularly around the climate issue in Sweden recently, and we at Stockholm Resilience Centre have been involved in a little bit of research in this, but Rich is an absolute expert with a long track record and history. He's a real specialist in democratic innovation. He's the CEO of the Iswe Foundation. He was the founder of a very well-known organization within this field called Involve in the UK. He's been advisor to multiple governments, the UK government, also international bodies, UNDP, the World Health Organization, OECD, the EU, and many NGOs and civil society organizations. And he's here to speak to us today about a really exciting initiative. Many people have been interested in these ideas of citizen assemblies at very local levels or national levels. And he's going to talk about an extremely ambitious and exciting project, the Global Citizens Assembly. So welcome, Rich, to stage. And you're going to speak for about, say, 20 minutes, see how you go. And then we're really happy to open up the floor for discussions. And the seminar will close at 4 o'clock. But if anyone wants to stay and continue to talk to Rich for a bit after that, we'll be able to keep the conversation going. Okay, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Tim. Well, great to be here. Yeah, it's on now. Great. Great. The green light is now on. Always a good sign. Great. So, who here is familiar with what a citizens' assembly is, just to get a sense of the audience? And who isn't? This isn't like a test; it's just useful. So there's quite a few people who aren't. That's fantastic. Thank you. So fundamentally, I would say we're something like 30 to 40 years into what we might call the fourth great democratic struggle. Over the last 150 years. The first was around anti-colonial rights. Second was around the struggle for voting, universal suffrage. Third, civil rights. And the fourth, I think was something like 30 or 40 into what we might call the right for self-determination ourselves. I don't think we know what it's called quite yet, but this project is a manifestation of that. You might know that there's been over 800 citizens' assemblies that we have identified across the world in the last 10 years. There's probably been a lot more of these kind of deliberative fora. And fundamentally, these are all attempts to kind of work out how we can do a better job of the governance chamber bit of democracy. And the reason there's been so many climate assemblies is because very, very obviously, and politics as usual, democracy as usual, is really struggling around climate. And I know that the work Tim and the SRC have done on the climate assembly, we certainly thought it was an excellent project. So the Global Citizens Assembly was first run, prototyped for COP26 in 2021, but it's the manifestation of a very old idea. It predates the UN. It's probably an ancient idea of like world citizen-led governance. And there was a worldwide views, which I was involved with for Copenhagen and for the Paris COPs, then the first Global Citizens Assembly for COP26. And now we're going to be launching a permanent citizens track managed by the Global Citizens Assembly as a legacy of COP30. So today's a great time to have the conversation. And really, the way I like to think about this project is a 10-year institution building project. And we're really going to think about it in terms of these five questions. Like, are we able to create more ambitious institutional action? Are we able to drive citizen actions, measuring it by self and collective efficacy? Can we build solidarity as an antidote to polarization? Can we build learning at scale as an antidote to misinformation? And can we undertake an inclusion? And can we get a politics which does these things? And we've learned that in different parts of the world, you need to design these processes really, really differently. And so we find it most helpful to start with these kind of metrics to think, in terms of the original question of the talk, now, can the Global Citizens Assembly make global governance more effective? These are the five ways we think about what being more effective means. So this is the 10-year plan. We've been working with the Institutional Architecture Lab, supported by Demos in Helsinki and UCL in London, who are really looking at what kind of institutions do we need at this point in kind of history. And one of the things they've been talking about is how can we really think about great public institutions that become loved like libraries, are integrated into the fabric of community, have this real sense of, something that's really important in our lives. So we're hoping that with the Global Citizens Assembly, we can begin to create that kind of sense of, human connection, humanity within how the kind of institution works. But what I wanted to do just to start with is just take just a few moments just to imagine. So we've got the United Nations, which is for member states. We've got the World Economic Forum, which is for companies, and the Global Citizens Assembly, which of course is for citizens. Let's just take just 20 seconds in silence just to kind of imagine, put yourselves forward 5, 10 years from now, just to imagine what it might be like, to have a powerful global governance body which was run entirely by citizens. So we have working with Tile, we've been looking at these 4 stages of institutional establishment: the diagnostic phase, prototyping phase, detailed planning and implementation, and then solidification and establishment and scaling. And we've been looking at through issue lenses: one climate, one AI, and one health. And we prototyped it for climate for COP26. Now we're in the implementation phase, but we're hoping next year to start the AI phase. We had a seminar running in parallel to the AI Action Summit earlier this year in Paris, and we had a retreat bringing together lots of the different kind of AI actors, companies, governments about 18 months ago to look at how we can do this. Interestingly, you might have seen Sam Altman from OpenAI has said he'd like to have a global citizens assembly to regulate AI. I don't think he knows what one is, but anyway, we will kind of jump off that support if it helps us get some funding. These are kind of 3 important reports that we commissioned last year to look at those different kind of areas: health, AI, and then the options paper on the end here, which we presented to UNGA 2 years ago, looking at what the options might be for a permanent global citizens assembly, supported by Gutierrez in COP26. And we spent a few days last week in Bonn talking to the UNFCCC team about how we can make this work for COP30. But for those of you who don't know, I thought now we'll just talk about what is a global citizens assembly, and because we're not just doing a new permanent institution, we are reimagining the model of citizens assemblies because we think we have to do that. At the heart of it are going to be community assemblies. And I know I met Jan earlier, who's been supporting these across Sweden. There is a movement around the world right now of people just taking the idea of citizens' assemblies and organizing them themselves. There are many countries now, there are hundreds of these springing up all around the world. And we've been working for the last couple of years creating digital infrastructure to just be able to tie together people who are organizing in the face of the crisis. So this isn't necessarily about doing something new, but it's about creating a digital infrastructure which enables people to come together. This is how we get scale. So we want to get 10,000 people engaged this year, 500,000 by 2027, and 1 million by 2030. So it's an ambitious project. These are examples of the community assemblies from the COP26 project. And I think the best way to think about this project is the global network a global network of people organizing in the face of the poly crisis that can cluster together on issues like AI, on issues like food systems, on issues like climate, or at national level. So we will be supporting over the next couple of years national groups of community assemblies, one definitely in Brazil, one probably in the UK, and probably in Indonesia and India and or India as well. And if someone wanted to do this in Sweden, they would be very welcome to join that movement. But this is really important because by creating these national level permanent assemblies, we can create pressure nationally, which is also how global governance fundamentally works. And Rachel Kite, the UK's climate ambassador, has been particularly keen on that kind of dimension. Then there's the global mini public. This is the classical element of what a citizens' assembly does. So it's sortish and selected. So we drop 150 dots around the world using NASA population data. Within 100 kilometers of each of those dots, we identify a independent community-based organization who go out and do door knocking. They identify 10 to 20 people that then can get segmented by age, education, views on climate, gender, and as many issues as we can afford because it costs quite a lot of money. Then they deliberate for 50 hours. We're going to do this in January, February, March next year. Then they go through the classical phase of learning, deliberation, and making detailed policy proposals. We're going to be using food systems as the lens onto the COP 3031 discussions. These are people who are from the COP26 process. And then there's the campaign, so working with movements, working with influencers, we've been doing some really interesting work with a UK-based movement called Hard Arts, trying to introduce this idea of political systems change and democratic innovation to cultural figures who can get the story out there in ways that we otherwise wouldn't be able to notice. And then, of course, there's a coalition. We currently have Brazil, Ireland, Vanuatu in the coalition. We're hoping the UK government will join us for the London Action Climate Week. We're expecting that to happen, and also other people are welcome as well. We haven't pushed this that hard in the last intervening period because we've really been focusing on raising the funds to be able to ensure we can launch this, which we now have done. Then there's the digital platform. So there's a digital platform for being able to support the community assemblies happen. And really, this is focused on the organizers themselves. So this helps them understand their theories of change, doing their power map, defining, how are you going to be able to gather your team? How are you going to be able to create impact wherever you work? Really interestingly, we're working with a network of European philanthropists who are hopefully going to support microfinancing of grants of between $500 and $1,000 going to some of the community assembly to support them achieving some of their goals. We've also been talking to global multilateral institutions such as the World Bank to see if they're interested in having that role as well. Those conversations have been super productive so far. This is some of the data that's going to come from the community assemblies process and the application. And then this is an idea of where they land and how we kind of connect them. And then finally to Brazil. So yesterday, my colleague Iñaki was in Panama, which was the kind of first big Brazil moment running up to kind of COP30. We've been working very, very closely with them over the past 6 to 12 months. I don't know if anyone saw this letter, the second letter from the COP30 president. It's kind of quite extraordinary in terms of the systemic language that's in this letter, where they talk about wanting to work in genuinely bottom-up ways, create socially determined contributions. I know that often these letters can seem as if they are sort of hyperbolic or unspecific, but I know for a fact that the people writing this are trying to kick the door open for multilateral change. That's what they're trying to do. It's a really important moment for those of us interested in being able to reform how global governance works. I can send this out over to you another time to see the detail on these slides there, but they're highlighting the bits where it's particularly systemic. So these are the kind of key moments in the run up to kind of COP30. So we're having the community assembly starting right now. So look on our website and see if you can sign up for those. In Bonn and in London, we'll be launching the process to the wider kind of climate community. In New York, we'll then be launching it to a wider kind of public audiences. And then at pre-COP, we're hoping to have an event supported by the COP30 president who will initiate the formal proceedings, having various events and activities within the Blue Zone at Belém. And then the deliberation starts January, February, March next year. Community assemblies are ongoing, and we present the presentations back to the presidency at the Bonn conference in June 2026. But really, what we're doing here is creating a new citizens track, a new annual assembly cycle, and whereby we have the Bonn final report happening in this, so it's slightly mixed up on the slides here. But basically, you have January, February, March, whereby we have the deliberations. We have the agenda setting happening in the run up to to Bonn, and then we will be presenting it pre-COP in the November timeframe. So we're creating an annual, a permanent new citizens track that's running in parallel to the UNFCCC process. But really, it all comes back to the citizens. So this is Yaslav, from Assembly member from Ukraine, talking about what he learned from being part of the original assembly. And this is Punima, also an assembly member. And I think one of the key transformative elements that happened through the first Global Citizens Assembly was simply creating this global deliberation, enabling people across the world to learn firstly about the climate crisis, and then about how they are experiencing it themselves. And for so many people, this was a transformational experience. That is it.
Just get my mic back on. Great, thanks, Rich. So really exciting to see what you have planned. But I think there'd be a lot of questions about where this idea comes from, and how you see this fitting in. How does this contribute to global governance? But we'll open up for the conversation then. Does anyone like to ask a question specifically about this, or about generally this sort of application of and ideas of deliberative democracy? Okay, the first question here. If you say your name, we know who you are, but everybody knows who you are.
Hi, I'm Owen Gaffney from Earth for All and Nobel Prize. And just to say, in this sort of bleak, dark world we live in right now, this is a place of hope and optimism. I think it's one of the best ideas and innovations, I think, in global governance. Now, but so you're saying, like, I like the way you're framing it as so you have the UN here, you have the Assembly, World Economic Forum. It's not, to me, clear how influential the World Economic Forum is and stuff on things. But in some of the original, so how did you had conversations, I think, on how close you would get to the UN, like whether it would be, right within Guterres's team or within ECOSOC and everything. But can you talk us through then your thought processes and I guess this group coalition processes to arrive at this? It'll be independent from the UN, but a sort of a friendly independence.
Yeah, absolutely. So I often think the way I think about this kind of docking relationship with institutions is a bit like the strings of a violin. You need to be able to have a strong relationship, with the citizens, but also a strong relationship to get the tension just right. And in different parts of the world, getting that tension right is like quite an art. So we're learning all the time, and actually I think it changes all the time based upon the politics, I would say. But how we're doing it on this occasion is we've got the coalition. Obviously, where we're inviting member states and others in. So in terms of the original paper we wrote, we came up with a bunch of options. One was to be sort of like to ask the SG, has he got a question? And then the assembly would kind of answer those questions. One of them was to work with ECOSOC, and one of them was to be almost like a world social forum kind of type models, really, really bottom up. And the other one was to have a relationship with existing multilateral processes, but not be in multilateral processes, which is what we've kind of gone for. How it's going to practically work this time is we have an institutional advisory group whereby people from the UNFCCC, Brazil, etc., sit on it to ensure there's a docking process as part of that. But that diagram that I showed right at the start of the 5 different actions, I think they're really, really critical from my perspective, because the truth is that achieving influence within that COP process is really hard. For anyone, it's really hard, and the truth. And there's a big discourse you might be aware of already that some people are saying that COP30 could be the last COP. This is quite a mainstream discourse now in terms of kind of climate multilateralism. I don't know if that will be the case or not. So what we need to do is create a infrastructure which can enable kind of policy to be produced, but also action to undertake, which is linked to the COPs, but isn't dependent upon them. So that's been our best way of kind of thinking of how to do that so far. Does that answer the question?
Great. We got one in the middle there, and then Malcolm.
So following up, so you plan to measure those 5 criteria in a way? How and how often? And
yeah, good. So we absolutely are going to measure them. So we've got pretty strong metrics for each of them. So under citizen action, we've got self and collective efficacy. Polarization, we're using social capital, bonding and bridging, Likert scale for learning and misinformation. The way I'll do policy, I think we shouldn't focus on policy impact, because I think policy impact is a distraction for on the ground impact. I know it's much easier to measure policy impact than it is to measure on the ground impact, but I've just seen such a huge gap in the climate space. And my government in the UK, pretty strong climate regime, pretty awful investments. So the gap between policy and implementation is so yawningly large that it feels a bit of a, we had a big impact on policy. Well, kind of, so what? I'm not trying to discredit that as an objective. I'm just trying to be honest about the gap that's in place. I don't think we've got particularly good, this might be a conversation to have with people in this room, is I feel like we haven't got particularly good ways at the moment of bridging that gap around that top level metric. So I'd really welcome, just discussions on that.
We have an online question that's connecting to the UK Assembly, so maybe we can do that, and maybe you can explain a bit for us who don't know so much. Or maybe you know.
Okay, so it's 2 questions basically from Marie Hernandez online. One, she was interested to know how the Citizen Assembly brings together citizens who operate in devolved parliamentary policy environments, which is quite unique in the UK, she writes. So that's number 1. And then also, how do organizations that work within the current systems, particularly within government bodies, support this global citizen assembly initiative and link to other stakeholders?
Yeah, so the second one is really easy one to answer, which is basically join the coalition and use the Assemblist tool, the community assembly tool, to run community assemblies in your institution. That would be a really easy way to do it. Also, if people are running assemblies, such as if you're going to have a follow-up for the Sweden Climate Assembly, we want people to plug in. So there are obviously people running lots of citizens' assemblies around the world right now. We're trying to use this tool to enable you to just to kind of plug in your data, plug in your findings, so that we can add that into the map. It's a much easier thing to say than it is to do, but we are offering that support for anyone who wants to do that. In terms of the first part of the question of how might parliamentarians from, like, are we talking about the Scottish and Welsh Assembly be part of it? Well, so we're not really, we don't have a track at the moment for any politicians to be part of the process. If that is the question, we really would be interested in being able to do that. There's obviously been really good examples in Ireland, etc. It is something that we have thought quite a lot about in terms of the sortition methodology. Just that when you're doing stuff at a global scale, it becomes pretty hard to think about who would you choose and why, and how would you make that representative. However, if there were, any local or national or regional governments that wish to run a community assembly to plug in, we would really welcome that.
Okay, great. We had a question over in the corner there. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. Uno Svedin, Stockholm Resilience Center. Thank you for coming. These things are hanging in the air and now sort of asking for concretion. My question, or asking you to discuss the deliberation approach from both a scaling level, as you also have indicated, and also the other that you mentioned, which has a specificness. I mean, the International Football Union is one. I mean, they are not doing anything else but football. So the clustering, and you also mentioned in your presentation, very interesting, by the way, that you would try to mix 2 structurizing types of styles. On the one side, you can cluster people and saying, we lock you up for a weekend, and you speak about anything and your definition of sort of the state of the world and so on and so forth. And then you have sort of small local groups doing that. The other one is that you take a specific case, like the food that you mentioned yourself, but it could also be anything like traffic or all sorts of things. And then you have a scaling on that one, sort of the international movement of those liking to use bicycles, for example. So these two things are different. And could you sort of dwell on the sort of the liberation, which is a move in sort of opening something broader than the usual way of structurizing, which is going to election every 4th year, that which is another way of answering that. So how do you handle this, the tension of structurizing these interests?
Okay, I'll try and answer those questions. So I'm going to start with the difference between the kind of community assemblies and the kind of core and the kind of global mini public. So the global mini public will be a pretty structured process. Where there'll be a learning process overseen by experts. So, for example, in the previous COP26 process, it was chaired by the ex-chair of the IPCC. So taking them through a learning journey. We're now reimagining that in a much more systemic way, and we're hoping to work with Future Earth and others, and potentially SRC, on that to ensure it's very systemically informed, the learning journey that people go through. We're going to be taking a food systems lens because we know there's policy gaps for that and scope for influence around the negotiation, bigger than in other areas. And also, it's just such a great route into deforestation, local community action, et cetera, et cetera. So we will have that kind of that process in the global mini public. The same process will be offered to the people running community assemblies. However, what we learn in the first time we ran it is that when people learn about the climate crisis for the first time, it is deeply traumatic for many people. It is, you know, so there were assembly members that we supported last time who learned about it for the first time and then wanted to use their time to reorganize action in their local communities, such as ensuring the mines they were working in were safe, to ensure that they wanted to kind of ensure that they felt that they had got strategies if they were at risk of flooding or further deforestation, et cetera, et cetera. And so having these emotionally intelligent, traumatically informed forms of facilitation are absolutely critical. One of the things that I didn't mention in my talk is really fundamental to how we're thinking about having a systemically informed lens for all of our components, of both the learning, the facilitation, but then also the outcomes, the outputs we seek to take. In terms of the facilitation, I really feel like, I think Otto Scharmer says it, that the quality of the process is the quality of the attention we can deliver in the facilitation there. I think it's absolutely critical. We're particularly training people both to be able to go down kind of the kind of theory U process. So you go down in terms of meeting the reality of the crisis and building the self and collective efficacy up the other side, but also we're not seeking to have a consensus-based process. This is really, really important. If consensus emerges, that's fantastic, but that isn't the objective here. What we're trying to do is to support people who violently disagree or, you know, seriously disagree, be able to do so whilst maintaining deep respect. Sometimes you could say potentially even cultivating love between one another. We've seen this in the best citizens' assemblies. They do achieve this. You get pro-choicers, versus pro-lifers coming together. They don't agree on the issue of abortion, but they increasingly respect the legitimacy of the other person to hold those positions. And then under those conditions, we've seen this in various abortion processes, the ability to have a policy environment that can protect vulnerable young people is put in place. That requires a certain kind of facilitation to do that, and that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do. That's going to take time to do that, but we're building a kind of a facilitation program that hopefully will start to support that. Does that answer some of the questions?
Great. Thanks. And yeah, Therese.
Hello, my name is Therese. Thank you so much for the presentation. If I heard you right, you were kind of talking about this Global Citizens Assembly in sort of relation to COP, like COP has become ineffective. Could this maybe be a more effective way of governing globally? And one of my understandings why the COP is not so effective is because it's been co-opted by commercial interests and sort of self-serving political interests. So how do you avoid, or like what sort of safeguards do you have in place so that the Global Assembly does not become yet another forum that becomes co-opted by the same forces?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And how does that co-option happen? Like, so we have so for our funders, we have a funders agreement process. What we did for COP26, we're putting that in place now, whereby they, just as you would if you were funding like a news agency, you can have no influence over the content or the discussion. So that's one of the ways of protecting that. Interestingly, we have lost some corporate sponsors because of that. We've only been approached by one corporate to sponsor us, and when I gave them the donations policy, we didn't. They disappeared from wanting to support us. So anyway. But then, a more challenging point we might be talking about is the inherent way in which we are all part of these deeply consumerist social media cycles, which are generating certain kinds of biases and perspectives. I think obviously that's fundamentally profoundly challenging for all of us. I think through the learning journey, there's a way of doing the learning in a kind of co-sensing collective way, which can seek to kind of overcome that. But that I think is particularly challenging.
Okay, I think we have Thomas. Oh.
Thank you, Rich. This is so exciting.
You say who you are?
Yeah, I'm Thomas Hahn, work here, Stockholm Resilience Center. 1/3 of the population live in China and India. So will 1/3 of this global assembly be from these two countries?
Yes.
And within each country, are you talking about facilitation then in all countries, or will there be some international facilitation? And the recruitment of the members, how do you avoid that most of the members will say that, yeah, I want to be because I'm a climate activist? So how can you mirror the population in the countries?
Yeah, so everyone can participate through their mother tongue, their native language. That's a kind of key component. In terms of this question around being 1/3 representative or not, I was slightly quick to say yes. So when I've run these processes historically, we've always run for what you might call a classical kind of pure demographically representative sampling approach. Okay. We had a sortition event, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. Funnily enough, this morning before breakfast, I was reading the report out from that to kind of see what we want to do now. We're trying to do our innovation and institutional design in the open. Within the multilateral space, you very often can overrepresent for vulnerable groups like small island states, etc. My personal preference is that overrepresentation or that representation of critical views happens in terms of providing a deposition, to the assembly or what you might call enclave or deliberation, like a community assembly of those particular groups, as opposed to, because when you've got samples of just 150 or 200 for the world, feels to me like we probably can't reduce the representation in that too much, because there isn't much scope for it. So, and your other question was, how do we deal with people who are just kind of pro-climate, climate activists, that kind of stuff? Absolutely. So that is the point of sortition, is really to do that. That's why that was going to introduced certainly in Europe, about 10, 15 years ago.
You just describe what sortition is,
yes.
for anyone who's not familiar with the technical term.
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't used to be when I first heard about it. It's basically lottery. It's a lottery process, so the idea is that anyone can be invited to come in. So historically, when we ran these processes, we would get often a polling company to make sure that it was statistically representative. But the problem is that only people who would turn up would be people who've already got some sense of often kind of self-efficacy in particular. They believe they can change things, and they usually care about the issue in question. Really problematic in today's world, when a lot of the people we really want to engage are the people who are opting out of politics, thinks that politics is broken, might support populist parties or whatever. Those are kind of critical for this process. So we absolutely do look at political views. I think that was on one of the slides. We look at political views on climate, and we definitely seek to get people who are so that bit is represented. Absolutely. Right.
Okay, so another question online is, if one is organizing citizen assemblies locally, for example, here in Sweden, where do you turn to sort of become part of this movement? Is there a network that one can turn to? And also, I thought kind of building on that question, or how are you reaching citizens as potential participants?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got this a website called assemblis.org, and there's a version of the slides which I put this morning, but aren't here, which has a new website in it. But it's assemblis.org, where you can just register your interest to run an assembly. However, I think Jan, who I met earlier today, is doing this, supporting communities in Sweden. So I'd be really encouraging people to work with people who are already doing stuff within the context. I think someone mentioned football clubs or sports clubs before. So what we're hoping to do is in September of this year in New York is get major kind of public brands like sports clubs, like we've met with the Brazilian FA, the Premier League in the UK. We're just trying to get anyone we know to kind of raise the profile of this to get as many people interested as possible. It turns out that football clubs have been for a long time showing some vague interest in this agenda, so we have those relationships there. We're also looking at influencers, celebrities, but going through networks, so like grassroots networks of schools, so we are going to be having a series of events starting in June, whereby we're going to try and recruit networks of organizations who want to run these community assemblies. But ideally, it's networks of people who are meeting already. So Avard, for example, will already run meetings. We've been talking to them about going through their network, and that definitely will happen. We just need to kind of design the algorithm to make sure it works for them.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. You say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Liam Carpenter Urquhart. I'm a PhD student here at the SRC. I'm curious about how this mechanism, given that there are a number of states, and I say this non-normatively, there are a number of states that are either explicitly or practically not democracies. How does like this really explicitly democratic process interact with political contexts where democracy might not be understood to be the norm?
Yeah, another great question. So there is actually a really strong culture of deliberative democracy in China, for example. So I thought when we ran the first Global Citizens Assembly, we'd struggle to get into some countries for that precise reason. That didn't happen. We have taken certain measures, to make that as easy as possible without affecting what we do. But so far, we haven't had that problem. I think these cultures of deliberative democracy are somehow, they're easier and more commonplace to introduce than some of the kind of more formalized representative democracy or whatever else. But certainly, there are definitely challenges in terms of people like speaking. So when we're facilitating meetings in different parts of the world, different people will be more comfortable being more vocal. So if you're facilitating a meeting between different countries, whereby you might have a very confident person from Germany talking to a less confident person from some other part of the world, it requires really skilled facilitation to kind of enable them to have a kind of meaningful conversation between one another. So it's so far for us, it's been more challenging in terms of the quality of the facilitation and the cultural norms around what we might see as democracy, than actually getting into those countries. But probably as we grow and as the profile raises, that challenge might become more acute for us. And of course, the world is way more fragile today, than it was for COP26 in 2021. And it might be that we can't, we have absolutely a plan if we're not getting into a country. And if we can't get into a country, we're going to, we're still going to keep going with the process. And we're going to look at whether we should have representation of diaspora or simply have a blank space on the screen. We haven't kind of worked it out yet, but we're definitely going to proceed regardless.
Thanks. Question now. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Eileen Murphy. I've brought a group of students here today from the University of Applied Sciences in Stralsund in Germany. I have a question just building on what you said about schools and education. As a professor, it's inspiring to hope in the future that I could teach students not to feel like victims, if you like, of being held under this umbrella that we can't go any further, but as change makers. And it would be really great to see that this would be integrated. Is that a hope that we don't just say, okay, these are the people that make decisions and you need to follow, but it would be really make such a difference to how we teach that students can see, they can go out and make a difference and not just go out and follow the rules.
So if people familiar with like transactional analysis, that kind of parent-child dynamics, people familiar with that at all? It's a kind of like tenet, a kind of social psychology. Everyone will be aware of it in this room. It's just sort of, it's a kind of such a classical frame. But basically, I would say that hopefully we're moving from a kind of a dysfunctional parent-child relationship in terms of our relationships with politicians and people to an adult-adult relationship. And to give an example, a kind of dynamic of this, so let's look at the relationship, for example, between say a doctor and a patient. So the doctor can prescribe the medicine, and she or he has the power to do that. And the patient has the power to either do the exercise or to take the medicine. I don't know if you know this, but over 60% of medicines are prescribed in WHO countries are never taken. So I don't know if anyone in their bathroom has got like a shelf of like I've got some big pink thick fluid that I got it, and I phoned from another friend of mine, doctor, should I take that? And she said, you should never take that. And so I was like, I'm not going to take that. But this generates massive costs, obviously. But what we're increasingly recognizing within healthcare, globally, is that doctors need to be able to build the agency of people to be able to take care of themselves. And I think it's very similar with politics. We need to recognize that it is up to people to how they change their lifestyle, taking action in their communities. They are obviously custodians of their parks, of their streets, whether they drop litter or not, etc. And unless we're going to move to a much more authoritarian state, which is a risk, of course, with increased, crisis, we saw it in the pandemic, etc., and less so in Sweden, but very acutely in other parts of the world. And so I think these projects are attempts to acknowledge the real power that people en masse have, to recognize the power that we have collectively to do stuff, and the limitations actually of political power. I don't know how many of you know politicians. I have lots of friends who are politicians. Do they feel very powerful? Do they feel they've got agency to tackle the challenges we face in the world? They absolutely do not. That is not the experience of politicians. How they feel they're locked into archaic systems with levers they can't really pull. My boss many years ago was an environment minister, and I remember when he said to me, he said, Richard, you think when you get into my position, you're going to have a lever of power, so you're going to be able to solve problems. Then you realize there's nothing attached to the lever. That was Michael Meacher, the environment. Some people might know the old environment. I remember him telling me that when I was a very young man. That's in a way where I started my career. So I thought, wow, if he thinks the lever's got nothing attached to it, we need to do something else. So I think hopefully there's this kind of movement towards recognizing the real power we've all got, and hopefully getting into a more healthy kind of adult relationship in terms of our politics. Obviously, we're 1,000 miles away from that, but that's my hope of where we can get to.
Great, thanks. Do we have a question here? No, I thought I saw some movement. An online question. Yep.
Yeah, so another question from Sama Abdallah online. Could you say a little bit more about your theory of change with the assembly? Is the aim for recommendations to influence COP? Are you trying to get governments to commit to responding, or is it rather you're hoping that the pressure will be built through media, for example?
Yeah, basically the slide I started with is a version of the theory of change. I've got a different, more complicated version of it, but we absolutely are not focusing upon trying to influence politicians. I think one of the errors of people like me have been advocating that it's all about having a political mandate for these things to work. And I had an extraordinary mandate when I was working under the Labour government from 2000 to 2010 to run these processes. Very often that mandate did not translate into political influence because we got stuck in the reality of politics. I think there have been really good examples, like of course the Climate Assembly in France, where Macron's mandate, I think, generated a lot of influence and power. Some people disagree, but 54% of recommendations implemented as a consequence of that process, I think, is extraordinary. But we have a five-pronged theory of change. So seeking to influence institutions, seeking to support citizens take actions themselves, as I think I mentioned during the talk, with grants going to citizens to be able to take actions themselves, generating the solidarity, learning at scale, and inclusion. So we're looking at absolutely all of those five different metrics as part of the theory of change. And I think what's really important, and I wrote this paper with Claire Mellier called "Getting a New Theory." I think it's called "Getting Real About Citizens' Assemblies: A New Theory of Change for Citizens' Assemblies." So really, really like small, easy to remember remember title. But basically what we said is you need to kind of be politically literate. You need to be power literate. We need to be clear about the insiders and outsiders. How does power really work? And so absolutely, we're trying to build relationships with power holders, either financial power holders or political power holders, to create influence. But in global governance, I don't know, have many people got experience working in any multilateralism at all? I don't know, it's got some experience. I mean, it's not like national or local government. It's the Wild West. No one's really in charge. These institutions have got convening power. They do have some power, particularly over security issues, particularly over refugees, but over things like climate, it's just not like local or national government. It's a very different environment. And so assuming you can take a kind of, even if you manage to get a national politician to say they're going to implement, well, are they going to be able to influence China, etc.? It's just not that simple. So we have to have theories of change that can be about galvanizing others kind of to take action, I think.
Great, thank you. We have a question here again.
I just want to endorse your initiative and this idea of going beyond the impact on policies exclusively, because this can generate skepticism, because we never get all the impact on policy that we want with these formats. So I understand that your expectation is that this bottom-up movement of community assemblies can feed in some of these large-scale and multi-impacts. And my question was, maybe you explained that and I miss it, but to be a community, a communitarian assembly, do you need to follow all the mini publics structure, or will that be a more open format where you can have other participatory democracy styles and so on? Because I think it's very, technical, like to organize an assembly is not an easy thing. So yeah.
So we're trying, in a way, with the assemblies tool to, in a way, enable anyone anywhere to run as high a quality assembly as they can afford to do with their with the resources or capability they have. And so in my experience, I've seen grassroots assemblies run in community halls for free that were much better than $100,000 processes run by, say, research organizations. I mean, that is actually quite frequent, actually, in terms of these things we're trying to achieve here. Now, I agree with you, it's a skill set, but I'm just saying that money doesn't necessarily get you what you want. But we're definitely trying to provide a mechanism to support anyone to run these processes, but also trying to maintain the quality as best as we possibly can. But again, I think one of the things that we learned previously is that once you've done the learning, you have to let people do what they want to do. You really do. It would be irresponsible to force people around a kind of a conversation around kind of like, fossil fuels. There's a relevant conversation, or deforestation, if what they want to do is take action in their communities and that's what they need to do. So I think we have to be really flexible. And I think the reason I frame this as a kind of 10-year R&D process is fundamentally, this is a project to try and, get money flowing into communities to build civic and democratic infrastructure, and seeing what are the things that work in different parts of the world. And we don't really know what is going to work in those parts, but we can have, I think these are pretty reasonable and pretty transferable metrics to go against, but the facilitation of process methodologies which deliver them are definitely going to be different in different places.
Can I just follow up on that and ask about how in this R&D process, international R&D, how are you hoping to learn from this sort of, if you've got this distributed design, how do you get the learning coming back and assembled and get some kind of order on that data, or have some sort of, do you have some sort of standardized data collection that you want people to implement?
So we helped set up GLOCAN, which is chaired by Professor Nicole Carato, which is this network of 30 academics globally to evaluate what we're doing. Absolutely. We're hoping they can work with us really closely, so it's embedded and provide real-time learning, not kind of like 2 years later. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just much less useful for us, because we're not saying we've got the answer. We're saying we'd like you to give us information that we can use. But frankly, I know our projects have generated a lot of papers and academic papers, so that's that, which is good. So we would really encourage people to do that. But I think in particular, we would encourage people to be able to, to evaluate what we're doing and generate learning what we can do, but in a way that can be really practically useful, both by us, but also by the other people trying to do similar work.
Okay, great. question there.
Hi, my name is Daria. I'm involved in a lot of Russian-speaking, actually, facilitation and some civil facilitation and some peace-building processes. And then I have a question actually about the facilitation processes and the people who facilitate, and also, like, if you could share a bit more, who are the people who facilitate them? And then maybe what kind of techniques and practices are they using? And also more on the language thing, because what we've experienced is that as soon as you make the process a bit more international, you run into the issue of the language, when you either have to divide people in groups who speak English or don't, or you have to translate things, which make things very unnatural often, or you kind of lose track of what people are saying because the group has to wait. And so how do you deal with these challenges?
I mean, it's kind of like the question, but it's one of the questions. Because, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think one of the real weaknesses of our prototype was that transaction issue. So basically how we did it previously is we used English as a transaction language, but every single mini public member had a person with them who would translate from their mother tongue into English and that sense. So we made it very, very slow, essentially what you're talking about. So AI is making a huge difference around that, the instantaneous translation, but it isn't quite good enough. It does create misunderstandings. So I think one of our big, technical challenges is how to make that the ability for us to talk to one another and digitally live in ways that are emotionally intelligent is one of our big challenges. I agree with that. There definitely is kind of key facilitation skills to be able to make that easier and make that better. And we actually have a whole kind of repository of kind of hand signals and all that kind of stuff that we developed to try and make that a bit simpler. But we'd be really delighted to share with you. But yeah, I think that's kind of at the heart. And I think the thing that is particularly important for us is this systemic dimension I mentioned before, supporting this kind of type 3 communication, being able to go to kind of more profound values, going down the U so you can really support people. But I think one of the open questions I think at the moment is like these 3 phases: learning, deliberation, and action. And it might be that in order for us to achieve some of these objectives, we have to go through language clusters. I'm really reluctant to do that because it's a transnational deliberation that's translocal deliberation that's really critical for building, solidarity or empathy and understanding between diverse people. But it seems to be that fundamentally we've got a trade-off between solidarity and learning and facilitation experience. That's kind of the trade-off we've got, and I think we're on a journey really to work out how to do that.
So bringing in people online before we're going back to the room, and we say a number.
Yeah, so there are some questions, one from Philip Baring and from Verian Nicholas that I think again are sort of connected or similar. Philip is writing, areas such as South Sudan are the most vulnerable to climate change, but are simultaneously the hardest to involve in these types of processes. How are these challenges managed? And Verian is asking about the marginalized communities and particularly in Global South. How are these communities being taken into consideration? And finally, also a good question from Nicholas King about whether you can sort of paint a picture for us what global to local governance might look like in, let's say, 2050, just 25 years away. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So in terms of the marginalized community, so in terms of the kind of the global mini public, we have got a plan for doing that, and it does that does work in terms of engaging them. But that's only 150, 200 people in that particular group. So we are able to achieve those groups, those kind of levels of representation. What we've done historically is we've targeted different groups. We have grants for specific community assemblies in different parts of the world. So that's part of the way that we've kind of tried to do that. There are often questions actually in places like South Sudan around, there's a difference between turning up to the event and talking, and even supporting the talking can sometimes be, can require an extra support around that. So I think, but I think we've to be honest with you, I think we've done pretty well around those marginalization tactics, etc., or the objectives in terms of this. These issues in terms of global to local in 25 years' time? I mean, it's a good question. I mean, a lot of me, I often think to myself, might not change that much. In terms of like, there's a lot of inertia in this. If you look at like how much have things changed in the last 100 years, not that much. How much things are going to change in the next 25 years? I don't know. So in terms of things, how things might, I think in terms of how citizens' assemblies might change, I think what we might see happening is I think we are going to see increasing amounts of institutionalization because most governments around the world are going to have a higher demand on their services, be it through aging population and cost of social care, all that kind of stuff, and a lower capacity to do things. And I think communities are going to want to do things. So what's been one of the really big shifts locally in the last 10 years is a shift from local assemblies being about simply providing policy recommendations to institutions which are getting stuff done themselves. This has been a really big shift that's happening. And I think we may well see a situation whereby we're creating this kind of global infrastructure where resources will flow into different communities just to get things done. I think we're going to see really interesting relationships between things like healthcare and participation. So social prescribing is already really, really big, a big idea. If we think of the numbers of people who are currently in most parts of Europe, for example, who are currently out of work, long-term out of work, kind of COVID tail, this kind of thing, I think there's going to be increasing pressure for people to be doing things, and these participation in these processes could be not just healthy, but they could be anyway, they could be incredibly good for people's well-being, for their mental health, for their social connection, etc. So I think there is a really interesting model whereby these things become more solid and the participation rates become higher. But we're a long way from that at the moment. I do expect within the next 5 years to see at least, I would say, 5 to 10 permanent national assemblies emerge. But what I think is really important is that they aren't just 150 people for that country. I think that just doesn't really work. I think they have to have roots in for other people to participate. Otherwise, they just become, I've seen it happen so many times in this world whereby essentially once you bolt a process like this into the system, unconsciously you become captured. This is the big problem we have. It's a big problem we all have because we have to get kind of really close to the institutions because we want to work with them, but then we get captured. And I once, many years ago, I used to be the deputy chair of the UK Science and Society program, a thing called ScienceWise. We commissioned a lot of these processes. I was an independent advisor for a nuclear process. It seems to me that it was, that it really wasn't objective, the way in which it was presented. So I ended up going on television saying that, in my opinion, the way in which they were presenting the different cases for and against nuclear did not feel at all objective, and therefore was breaking the regulation guidelines. The government tried to get me fired at that point from my job, but luckily my board did stand behind me. I was proved to be correct. 18 months later, the MRC did find out that process was breaching those guidelines, but it was a hot place for me to be quite a long time. So I think as we're in this process of building the new democracy, we should expect it to get hot, and that's a good sign. That means that the status quo powers care. So I think we should expect conflict, we should expect resistance, and we should really, really welcome it. But we should prepare ourselves in terms of there's a way in which I think that unless you're getting pushback, you're probably not doing the right thing.
Okay. We're just approaching 4 o'clock, so we should. I think that's a really good partial ending point. Your kind of vision for the future, different ways that the democracy can go. As I say, you're still able to stay around for a little bit. So I think if we can give Rich a great thank you for the talk. Anyone who wants to leave can leave, and then
thanks. Thank you.
Really interesting ideas to take home. Anyone who needs to leave can leave, and then maybe we'll give you a break. And then if anyone wants to stay around and ask further questions or develop the discussion more. And we'll close online as well. So thanks very much for joining us online. And thanks for your excellent questions.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all. Thank you.